Hello everyone, my name is Art Russell. Welcome to my channel. I'm sure that many of you have heard of the infamous federal penitentiary called Alcatraz that's located on an island in San Francisco Bay. It was closed in 1963 and currently serves as a tourist location. Someone very dear to me recently toured it with their daughter. In this video, I'm going to use Alcatraz as a metaphor for the human condition. Only in this case, the prison is the perspective of the person. I'm sure that many of us at one point or another may have felt trapped by our mind-made persona. Perhaps someone expected us to behave in a certain way and we didn't really want to, but we went ahead and did whatever they desired and then resented having to do it. Or perhaps we remained too long in a dead-end career and resented that we didn't have the courage to dream a bigger dream as far as our career goes. Now, with regard to enlightenment, the metaphor is flawed in some ways, but I believe we can still use it. In the case of the prisoners on Alcatraz, they believed that they had to take their persons off the island to gain freedom. Perhaps by swimming across the dangerous waters of San Francisco Bay to a distant shore, or perhaps to a boat that was waiting to provide rescue. With enlightenment, we cannot take our person with us. That's not how liberation is gained. Liberation is gained when we transcend the perspective of the person. Now, some of you might be asking, thank you, Art, but even though you're referring to my person as a prison, I like it very much. My Alcatraz is just fine. And if that's the case, I hope that circumstances remain favorable for a long time to come. But I think that many of us, if we live long enough, realize that life has a way of balancing out. There's these polar opposites of pleasure and pain and good and bad, and ultimately life seems to balance these out, and it can be very trying. So I'd like to give you an example, a few examples of the human condition. Let's say death of a spouse, especially if we've been deeply in love, very attached to the person, equals Alcatraz. The person's given a terminal diagnosis is Alcatraz, especially if they are not ready to transition yet, especially if they'd like to have more experience here on earth. Someone living in abject poverty with barely enough food to eat or clean water to drink, that can be Alcatraz. So I'm not trying to be negative, but we see that ultimately life can be suffering, just as Buddha said, to live is to suffer. Now, contrary to common misconception, it is not a person that wakes up in the morning. I know that sounds odd. It's actually a perspective in consciousness that awakens. Now, this is easier to understand if we contemplate or remember that our senses function more like gates. They allow data to stream into a center, and that data is then interpreted as form. Using the example of eyesight, this is easier to understand. If we think of our eyelids as shutters, we realize that when the eyelids are closed, there's nothing seen. When the eyelids open, in streams light, and that light is interpreted into representational forms. Now, the assumption is that there's a real world made of matter somewhere out there. But that's an assumption. And science has been proving this for many, many years in the search for matter. For instance, we know that atoms, which were once believed to be the building blocks of so-called material world, are 99.999% empty space. So how do we get matter out of empty space? Now, this is easier to understand also if I'm going to use an illustration that came to me yesterday, and I hope it will have some use here. So just bear with me and I'll explain it later. Everything, nothing. Everything, nothing. Everything, nothing. Now, what this is meant to represent is everything is flashing into creation and then out of creation. Creation, destruction, creation, destruction. Now, this is all happening in trillionths of a second or at a speed, I'm not sure, but it's happening so fast that we process interpretations as solid matter. No such solid matter exists. Now, what backs this up is if we contemplate our nighttime dreams. Let's say that we imagine that we're riding a camel across a desert, and it feels very real at the time. Perhaps we even smell the camel, or we feel what it feels like to be in a saddle, if there is a saddle on this camel. And perhaps we're riding across the desert towards an oasis. Again, during the dream, it feels very real. But when the perspective of the person awakens in the morning, we realize, wow, that was just a dream. I guess that's a good thing, because I don't really want to be stranded out in a desert. There's no evidence of a camel, the sand, saddle, any of that. And this is what I'm saying is actually occurring here. This is all made out of one non-thing, consciousness. Why do we know this? Because consciousness is the only non-thing out of which it can be made. So some of you may be left asking, so Art, if there is no actual person that exists independent of the mind, and that is what I'm actually stating and sharing, what are we? Now, I would say that we are consciousness. Now, some would say that we are God dreaming the incarnation of a human being, and I would definitely agree with that position. I would call it truth. Now, this is not a conceptual freedom in which we think or believe that we're free. This is when we actually know that we are freedom itself. If you've enjoyed this video, I invite you to subscribe to my channel or click a like. There's information available through my blog at thinktwice.me and also through my book entitled This Taste of Flesh and Bones, available from Amazon. Bye for now. We'll talk again soon.